Let's assume that you're taking a major warship into battle in the age of armoured ships. You've opened fire on the enemy, and at least one of your shells has scored a hit. Well, congratulations. And even better, it's hit something that's fairly heavily armoured, so whatever's on the other side of that armour is likely to be quite important to the continued functioning of that enemy vessel. It could be their machinery, it could be their magazines, it could even be the guns in a turret that has just been shooting back at you. However, the next stage of proceedings is that shell actually has to penetrate the armour that it's hit. How this occurs depends, to a certain extent, on what kind of shell you're firing and what kind of armour you're hitting. A solid sphere of iron hitting an iron plate in the 1860s is going to be a rather different affair compared to a capped armour-piercing shell hitting face-hardened crop-style steel in World War I or World War II. And everything in between those scenarios. So for the sake of simplicity today, we're only going to consider the mechanics of shell penetration during that latter World War I and World War II period. And so the assumptions we're making is that the shell is moving relatively fast, it has some kind of armour-piercing cap on it, and it's impacting a steel plate that has a hardened face and a softer back, but is a homogeneous lump of metal. Note that, of course, as a result, descriptions that apply to tank versus tank engagements, particularly in World War II, or shortly thereafter, do not actually usually apply, because how most tank shells penetrate most tank armour, at least if we get into modern composites, is a slightly different kettle of fish to capped AP shells hitting face-hardened Krupp steel. There are exceptions to that rule, but anyway. The main problem that you now have is that your shell is necessarily a rigid, hollow body, because it's got the explosive in it, which is impacting a much more massive armour plate. At the point of contact, with a shell being a relatively hard object, and the face of the armour also being hard, you're going to run straight into one of Newton's laws of motion, the one that says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And thus, if a, relatively speaking, pointy shell hits the armour plate, the force of the shell's impact is of course transmitted to the armour, but an equal and opposite force of resistance is transmitted back into the shell. Now, in a collision that occurs over time between softer, more ductile objects, the distribution of the energy involved may be spread out somewhat over that time, as compared to between relatively hard and rigid objects. But there will always be an initial shockwave that propagates from the brief moment when neither projectile nor target have deformed to any significant degree. That shockwave, incidentally, is what generates most of the splinters when a cannonball hits a wooden ship's side, but I'd advise going to see the video that was done about that at the Vasa Museum if you want to learn more about that rather older type of shot versus hull interaction. Now in our case, because we're looking at face-hardened plate armour versus a relatively hard shell, not counting the AP cap for a minute, and you'll see why in a second, the shockwave would of course be far more powerful, partially due to the much greater energies involved, and partially because, thanks to the hard nature of both objects, the time involved in transmitting the energy is much reduced. This is, for example, why you can take a glass marble, fairly chunky one, and drop it onto a wooden table, and it probably won't shatter, but do the exact thing onto a solid metal anvil, and there's a fairly good chance it will. It's exactly the same energy, it's just how that energy is distributed over the time of impact. Now what this all adds up to is there are now two rather large stresses acting on the shell. The shockwave travelling into the shell from the point of impact, and the compression of the shell due to inertia, as at the moment of impact the tip of the shell has either stopped or at least slowed down substantially, depending on exactly how fine an analysis you're doing, but the rest of the shell body is still trying to progress in the direction it was going before. Left in this state, either the shockwave could cause the shell to shatter, or the compression could cause the shell to split and concertina down on itself, or more realistically, a combination of both would make the shell burst apart from the inside, leaving you with, at best, a low-order explosion external to the armour plate. There is a shockwave that's transmitted into the armour as well, but the armour plate is much more massive, it's not hollow, it has external support and bracing, and all of that serves to distribute these forces somewhat better. So in this scenario, it's probably going to survive without all that much damage. Note, of course, that if you have a very large shell, like say Yamato's 18.1 inches or the 16-inch Super Heavies, impacting very thin armour, say on a light cruiser, that pretty much flips all of the above around. But since we're assuming that we're talking about a capital ship on capital ship engagement here, in order for your shell not to just blow itself apart on impact, it has the armour-piercing cap on it. Now, depending on exactly how hard that armour-piercing cap is, the effects upon impact can be slightly different, but since the harder type of armour-piercing cap is far more common if you aggregate all World War I and World War II battleship shells as a whole, we'll consider that scenario. The armour-piercing cap is going to be attached to the main body of the shell, but not by much. The attachment points have to be just enough to ensure the cap stays on while the shell is being fired, while it's flying through the air, and during the initial impact, but that's really about it. Now, the armour-piercing cap should not be confused with the wind shield, which is a much more elongated cone-like casing that goes on top of the shell and the cap and is present for aerodynamic purposes. It's so thin and fragile relative to everything else that's involved in this collision that, although it pretty much disintegrates on impact, it can essentially be regarded as not present for the purposes of armour penetration. Now, when the armour-piercing cap hits the armour, you're going to get the same issues that we described previously with shock waves and compression from inertia and so forth. Except that the shockwave travelling through the AP cap is going to tend to shatter the connections with the main body of the shell, thus preserving the shell from the initial worst effects of that initial impact shockwave, since transmission of shock, even through materials that are touching, is generally slightly less efficient than the transmission of that same shock through materials that are physically joined together. Next, since the AP cap is essentially just a solid concave mass of metal, it can be made substantially harder than the shell body, which can't afford to be too brittle. And so the armour-piercing cap, driven on by its own inertia as well as that of the shell behind it, essentially starts to mutually annihilate with part of the armour plate, ideally punching a divot into the hardened face even as the combination of the impact shockwave, the continuing collision, and the pressure exerted by the fact it's now caught between the armour plate on the one hand and the oncoming rest of the shell body on the other, will tend to destroy it. Of course, if the armour is severely overmatched by the incoming projectile, then that armour-piercing cap may be carried on through in whole or in substantial part, but for the purposes of what we're describing, we're assuming that the shell and the armour are relatively well matched and that if penetration is going to occur, it's going to be only just. Now, the initial divot that the armour-piercing cap has created is then exploited by the main shell body, which now has less absolute thickness of armour to penetrate, and much less of the hardened face to get through. And if this impact occurs away from the perpendicular, this may also give the shell a degree of normalization, realigning the shell closer to perpendicular, which is the ideal if you want to maximize penetration, and that happens in part due to the friction of some part of the armour-piercing cap being the first bit to hit the armour before the rest of it, which generates a rotational moment towards perpendicular. Now, all of this also has the effect of pre-stressing the armour plate somewhat, such that when the shell body comes through either the disintegrating armour-piercing cap or it just shoves that cap onwards, the cumulative effect is to allow the shell as a whole, or the body on its own, an easier job of punching through whatever protection happens to be left. Now, of course, all of this takes place in a fraction of a second, and this is a hugely simplified overview of armour penetration by battleship shells in World War I and World War II, as in reality you'd have to account for other things, including but not limited to the impact being at least somewhat more along the lines of fluid mechanics as opposed to solid material collisions, which is what you might expect, along with dealing with spectacular rises in temperature due to the energy exerted at the point of impact and the effect that that has on everything, particularly the metals and their ability to resist things. And this is one of the reasons why examining shell penetrations on battleship armour can, either in part or in whole, end up with remains of the armour plate that look more like the armour was melted and someone then pushed through it, rather than a shattered or torn piece of solid metal, which you might otherwise expect. And also will explain why this perceived effect might vary as you go through the depth of the penetration. Now, whether all this energy is actually going to be enough to get through the armour, or if the plate is going to stop or eject the shell, comes down to, well, how much material the shell has to get to compared to the amount of energy that it arrives with, and hence why the angle of fall and the speed of impact, which is related to the shell's range, will give you different figures of penetration for different guns in different scenarios. And of course, exactly what kind of material, in terms of hardness, tensile strength, etc., that you've made both the shell's components and the armour from, is going to affect matters as well. And, of course, that's before you have various variables from the battle, which may include, but again are not limited to, the role of the target ship, which could change the angle of impact at any given moment, the quality and reliability of the shell propellant, which may cause the shell to arrive with more or less energy, or at a steeper or shallower angle than you would theoretically have it do on paper. You could have quality controls with the armour plate, and, of course, whether or not your shell's fuse is actually going to work properly and allow the shell to do its best to go through the armour before blowing the shell apart from the inside. Now, all of this is a brief primer to explain, again in very basic terms, why shells are capable of punching through armour, but also why things might not necessarily work out quite as well as what on-paper stats suggest. Or conversely, they might also work out substantially better than what your on-paper calculations suggest. So we're now going to look at some brief examples of when a ship was hit and how its armour performed. Of course, there's a preface to this as well, because we have to point out that the ships that were hit the most, and therefore provide the best case studies, or were hit in the most interesting ways, tend to also be the ones that got sunk, and so examining those hits in extreme detail is much, much harder, potentially even impossible, whereas ships that survive tend to do so by not actually getting hit quite as much, which leaves us with a much smaller pool of data to draw on. And additionally, even when we can look at a wreck and see damage physically, such as when you look at the perforated conning tower of Bismarck, the fact the ship sank and its records were mostly lost means that we're in a much worse position when we're trying to work out exactly when that particular hit took place, and thus correlate between the ship's own logs and the logs of the people who were firing at it, at what range that impact took place. Now, although an estimation can be made, there's enough of a margin of error in time in those estimations that assessing if the shell in question did better, worse, or pretty much as expected is almost impossible, except in very, very niche outliers. Now, the examples we're going to be looking at are all from World War I, or in one case very shortly thereafter, but using World War I technology. If you'd like me to do a follow-up to this video where we look at some World War II examples of armour-piercing shell impacts on capital ship-grade armour, or perhaps some of the other impacts from World War I, then let me know in the comments, but I thought this was a nice grouping to start with. Now we're going to lead off with the most recent of the events for this grouping, the Baden trials. Now, of course, the German battleship Baden was one of the few ships that were prevented from sinking completely when the bulk of the High Seas Fleet scuttled itself in Scapa Flow, and after the war, the British decided, well, let's use this ship for some testing. In this particular case, tests of the then new Green Boy 15-inch shells in various circumstances and of various types. For this purpose, the Baden was given an 11-degree list towards the Monitor HMS Terror, which was stationed a short distance away and armed with a pair of 15-inch guns. The charge for each of Terra's guns was reduced such that the shells would hit the target at around about 1550 feet per second, with an angle of fall, resulting from the shell leaving the gun and travelling that distance, of just under 2 degrees. Now, since Terra was close enough to pick out individual elements of Baden to target, that's why that drop in and of itself is fairly small. You combine that drop, however, with the artificial list, and the shells are now impacting at an angle of about just under 14 degrees. The overall effect of the reduced velocity and this revised angle of impact essentially simulates the effect of a shell that is striking having been fired about 15,500 yards away without actually having to shoot from that distance. The ship was, of course, also rolling a little, as it would be in actual battle, and so the precise angle of impact for any given shot would vary a little bit by a degree or two. Various parts of the ship were targeted by AP rounds, HE rounds, and CPC rounds, but the shots of interest to us for this video are a few that were directed at 350mm or 13.8-inch armour plate, specifically the armour plate found on barbettes, turret faces, and conning towers aboard the Baden. Whether these shots would penetrate on paper depends on which particular source you go with, but most of them seem to suggest that a World War I era shell, such as these that were used, would struggle to penetrate at the simulated range, and only the later World War II era shells, which are slightly heavier and somewhat more modified, would have a reasonable chance of going through, and even then, probably only just about. But of the 3 APC shells that were fired at this armour, the first managed to penetrate the barbette armour of one of the aft turrets and caused substantial damage to the turret rollers inside, which would have disabled the turret's ability to traverse in combat, essentially knocking it out of action. Now, what effect that this internal explosion would have had on the men and the ammunition in the vicinity is unknown, as of course, being a hulk, neither of these were present. The next shot was directed against the front plate of the forward superfiring turret, and this went all the way through, fetching up against the right-hand gun's recoil slide. The first shell hit at a cumulative angle, once you account for the drop as well as any horizontal displacement, of around about 11 degrees, and the second came in at somewhere around 17 degrees, give or take a degree, as the turret was partially turned away from the Terra. And once again, these are cumulative angles, taking into account the angle of fall and the horizontal angle. The last shot hit at a cumulative roughly 30-degree angle on the conning tower, and although the armour of the conning tower broke, cracked, bulged, and the plate was driven in by the hit, ultimately the interior of the conning tower remained broadly intact, although spalling was found to have pinged around inside, and of course what effect that plus transmitted shock might have had on the crew was unknown due to, obviously, the understandable absence of any living beings in there in the first place. Overall, therefore, the 15-inch 42 with the Green Boy shells overperformed compared to expected on-paper data by almost an effective 2 additional inches of penetration, except when it was fired at a significantly greater angle of impact. This suggests that German ships of World War I, with armour up to 350mm thick, would be entirely vulnerable to 15-inch shell fire in, let's say, a theoretical 1918 last stand of the High Seas Fleet scenario, at pretty much any range under 20,000 yards, once you've adjusted the penetration curves, with the exception, of course, of any impact that took place at a significant cumulative angle. Now, onto a ship that was actually hit in combat. Von der Tann was, of course, hit several times at Jutland. One hit right aft at extreme range from Barham seems to have come in from a distance of between 22 and 23,000 yards. The armour that was struck was part of the ship's extended distributed armour, and thus it was only about 4 inches thick at the most. So, even at this kind of range, penetration should in theory have occurred. However, it seems that the shell exploded whilst it was still on its way through the armour plate. Now, there are a couple of potential reasons for why this occurred. Firstly, this hit occurred just below the waterline, so the shell in question would likely have been somewhat slowed and potentially also have had its fuse prematurely initiated by impacting the water first. And the other possibility is simply that, as so often happened at Jutland, the British shell fuses or the shell's explosive filler was just overly sensitive and it detonated early anyway. In either case, the explosion caused large chunks of armour to still break off, and the 4-inch plate was also significantly displaced, which in turn allowed 600 tons of water to flood in, as well as whipping the stern of the ship back and forth several times. The other hit, which landed directly on substantial plating, was a hit from HMS Tiger on the foremost turret's barbette, which was 8 inches thick at the point of impact. This appears to have taken place at somewhere between 16 and 18,000 yards, a range at which one would maybe just about expect a 13.5-inch shell of the period to penetrate. It seems in this case the shell definitely exploded too early, but it had already sufficiently penetrated such that the explosion blew a large hole, 35 inches across, in the barbette anyway, with the debris carrying into the barbette, destroying the turret's rotation motors, flames from the explosion causing 8 casualties, and thus the turret being jammed. It was also noted that the impact cracked the barbette armour over a considerably wider area than just the hole that was blown through it, indicating that, if not for the premature detonation, the shell probably would have made it all the way through, much like the 15-inch shell made its way through Baden's barbette. And then we have Seydlitz. Now, of course, I've already done a video on Seydlitz and the various hits that she took at Jutland, and so instead, let's look at the hits she took at Dogger Bank. At a range of about 17 to 17,500 yards, she was famously hit by HMS Lion on the barbette of one of her aft turrets. Now, this is quite an interesting one, as penetration itself was technically not achieved, but almost all the effects of penetration were. The shell punched through the deck and then hit the 9.1-inch thick barbette armour. Now, at this range, on-paper calculations suggest that penetration is going to be flat out impossible, and indeed the shell exploded whilst it was in contact with the armour rather than after it had gone through. However, it seems that the shockwave cone from the impact, as initially occurred, had weakened the armour enough, specifically along those fault lines, that the explosion then broke out a vaguely mushroom-like plug of metal about the size and shape that you'd expect to be displaced by actual penetration, and it then sent that lump of superheated armour steel into the barbette's internal areas. This set off the charges inside, and the resulting conflagration eventually would burn out both aft turrets to great loss of life. Incidentally, if people are wondering how we know the shell didn't make it through, in the aftermath, when Seydlitz got back to port, they investigated and they found all the fragments of the shell outside the barbette and none inside, which indicated that when the shell exploded, there was something stopping fragments from getting inside, which would be the plug, which was pushed through instead. There was a second hit, also a 13.5-inch shell, at a broadly similar range, maybe 1,000 yards less or so. This hit the 12-inch armour belt, but it failed to do much more other than shove the belt in a little bit. That resulted in a small amount of leakage, as the amount the belt had been shoved in was not greater than the thickness of the plate, and so nothing major happened. As this hit was well beyond the range where penetration was likely, that outcome is not exactly surprising. Now, what about the ship that hit Seydlitz in the first place, Lion? Now, of course, Lion was hit numerous times at Dogger Bank in revenge, but one shot around 11:45 is quite notable, as it hit the 9-inch main belt at a time when we can be pretty sure of the range. In this case, it was probably just a little bit over 16,000 yards. And we can also be sure of which ship was responsible, the 12-inch armed battlecruiser Der Flinger. Now, at this range, the German 12-inch shell on paper is just about capable of punching through 9 inches of armour. But the relative angle between the two ships was quite severe, so there was quite a lot of horizontal angling going on. And so, like with the significant angle of impact that occurred when Baden's conning tower was hit, penetration then moved to become unlikely. And that is, in fact, what happened. The shell burst on the armour, but didn't penetrate, but the force of the explosion and the physical impact of the shell did manage to shove the plate inboard. This caused leaks and managed to also crush the portside boiler water feed tank aboard Lion, which had some rather deleterious effects on the British ship. Another ship that was present at Dogger Bank, but was also present at Jutland, was HMS Tiger. Now, at Jutland, Tiger was hit numerous times, mostly by the 11-inch guns of Moltke. The precise timing, and therefore the ranges at which most of these hits occurred, are a little difficult to discern due to obviously having to match up the partial records from both sides in terms of when Moltke fired, when Moltke thought it saw hits, and then matching those hits up to when Tiger reported hits, and so on and so forth. But where something can be said without doing days and days and days of research on every single hit is a pair of 11-inch shell hits on her 9-inch belt armour, which came between the two aft turrets. Now, depending on the precise timing of when these hits occurred, they should either have passed straight through the armour or been just at the edge of penetration if you use paper figures. But neither of those shells managed to get through, or actually even come close to getting through. This is likely a combination of some horizontal angle component to the impact, as well as the quality of Tiger's armour plate. British armour plate for any given thickness actually being quite good. A number of other hits, mostly by 11-inch shells, were recorded on various barbettes and turrets at closer ranges, but exactly what those ranges were is more difficult to discern than those two belt hits. And the damage that they caused is varied. A 12-inch shell, for example, failed to penetrate the foremost turret's barbette, although fumes and smoke were generated inside said barbette. And both aft turrets were hit by 11-inch shells. The shock of the impact on the face armour of X turret caused spalling, which temporarily knocked out the turret and caused a number of casualties, but the crew were able to get the turret up and running again in 7 minutes. The hit on Q turret, however, seems to have largely actually been a hit on the sighting hood, and is thus of less interest to us in determining the effectiveness of the armour plate, because of course the sighting hood was not particularly heavily protected. So, those are some of the hits to major armour plates and their results from World War I and just after. Now, one thing you'll immediately notice is that in a number of these cases, just the fact the shell didn't penetrate didn't necessarily mean the ship was entirely safe, as a shell that was exploding whilst it was partially in the plate could cause effects that were almost as bad as if it had gone through, and even if the armour wasn't actually physically penetrated in any real manner, the energy involved in the collision and the subsequent explosion could actually displace the plate enough that if its supporting structure wasn't strong enough, this could cause major leaks, as well as potentially crush any machinery or people who were unfortunate enough to be just on the other side of said armour plate. So beware, it's not just about the thickness of the armour, it's also about the environment that armour sits in. So with that said, hope you enjoyed that brief summary, found it quite interesting, and see you again later.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.